presentation for logical database from the SRS, and we'll just be going over what the database will include and why it includes that, and then the steps for verification and the risks associated with the logical database requirements. Next slide.
This is the consumer user table, and this stores all the information that a consumer user account would have. So it would include things like a unique ID that would be different from every other account, and it would store things like a first name, last name, the role, email address, gender, and a lot of other things. And it also includes information about how many events the user has attended and also how many the user has hosted. So next slide. And so we have to verify that the table actually holds all this information. And so we do this through the demonstration method. So the demonstration method for this table includes creating a consumer user account and putting all information into that account. So the first name, last name, the role, and all the other information. And then after all that information is entered, that information will be retrieved from the database, and that information will be displayed on screen. This ensures that the database is actually holding that information. Next screen.
So next we have the commercial user table. The commercial user table is very similar to the consumer user table. The only difference is the commercial user table is focused around businesses and the accounts that businesses will be creating on the Uvents application. It contains all of the necessary information for an account under the commercial user. It's going to include things like a unique ID, the business information, third-party payment plans, and third-party pages associated with the business. So these will include anything from the business name to a picture of the business to the way that the business is going to be paying to place events on the application, and any social media that the business may have connected to the account. And so to verify this, we basically need to verify that the database is storing the correct information for the commercial user. So we will be using the demonstration method to do this. And first we're going to create an account, then we will retrieve the entered information from the Uvent database, and then we will display the information on screen to ensure that it is exactly as we have entered it, and this will ensure that the database is taking the information that is entered and storing it correctly. Next slide.
So next is the event table, which has all the information about events that are created by commercial users. And so it will contain the organizer, which is the commercial user who created the event, and then information about the event, and then whether that event is active, meaning currently going on. Next slide. To verify the event table, we'll have to create an event and fill in all of the possible columns, so all of the different information about it, and then query the database and display the values contained in the columns to make sure that they're the ones that are expected. Next slide. The event media table is used to connect a piece of media to an event, and so it will contain an ID to represent that pairing, and then the ID of a certain event, meaning a commercial user's event, and the media, which will be stored as text. Next slide. Verification for the event media table will be pretty much the same as the others, just adding a piece of media to an existing event in the Uvent database, and then displaying the columns to make sure that they have the expected values. Next slide. The group event table is very similar to the event table. This is for events that are created by consumer users, and so it'll also have the organizer, which will be a foreign key to the consumer user table, and then information about the event, and then whether it's a date or not, and the maximum number of participants. Next slide. This will be verified the same way as events, where a group event will be created with all the columns filled with a value, and then the columns displayed and compared to the expected values. Next slide. The event participant table links a participant, which is a consumer user, to a group event. And so it will contain the ID for that pairing, a link to, well, a reference to the consumer user table for which user is the participant, and then a reference to the group event table for which event they're a participant of, and then their approval status to say whether they have been only invited to the group event or if they've requested to join, and if that request has been granted and they're approved to join. Next slide. This will be verified in the same way as the others, where a participant will be added to an existing group event in the event database, and then the columns will be displayed to the tester and compared to the expected values using the demonstration method. Next slide.
So the next table is the user report table. This table will show a relationship between a reported user, a reporting user, a report type, and an associated event. The table will include a report ID column as the primary key, a report user ID as a foreign key, and another reported user ID as a foreign key. It'll also have an event ID that is also a foreign key to the other tables that have been listed, and then it'll have a report type. Next slide. The user report verification will be very similar to all of the other verification using the demonstration method, where we create a new user report and insert it into the user report table. And the information from each column will be displayed to the screen to verify that the correct information is in the user report table. Next slide.
So the conversation table and the conversation participant tables are pretty similar. They all just contain the ID to indicate the item. And for the conversation table, it has an event ID to store the event of the ID of the event, which should have a reference to the event table. And as for a conversation participant table, it store a little more than just 2. It stored 3, but all 3 of them should have a reference to the other tables. Next. So the verification for those 2 tables are pretty similar to what all my teams have demonstrated before, which we're just using a demonstrating method, putting in data, and then we're gonna retrieve all those data from the database, and making sure that the output we get is exactly the same compared to expected output. Next. So for message table, as you can see right here, we have a message ID as a primary key to store the message ID. We have an originator that would just be whoever started this message, started the conversation, to indicate the conversation starter. And then we have a conversation ID to reference to the conversation, and we have a content of the message, which store the message. We have a date and time, which just referring to the time, and we have the status. It's very similar to what we have on our phone. When we send out if you had an iPhone, there's a different status on each text you send. There's a seen, there's sent, there's received, but right here we have a delete, which is a little different because in this app we allow users to delete the message they sent. So, yep. Next. So the verification for the message table is basically the same as the tables before. We'll still be using a demonstration method, and the main idea of it is just we have the data restored, and then we retrieve it, and making sure that the output is just exactly the same as the expected. Next.
All right, so the notification table will include all pertinent information about notifications that are sent to consumer users. The table will include a notification ID column, a consumer receiver column, and a notification type column. Next slide. For the verification, we're going to do the same as we did with all of the other slides. We're going to create a new notification and insert it in the database, and then retrieve that same notification from the database and display it to the screen to make sure that the information is how we expect it to be. Next slide. And then the bid table will store the monthly bid amounts from the businesses. The bid table will include a business ID column, a month column, a year column, and an amount column, and a paid column. Next slide. The bid table will be verified using the demonstration method, just like the other tables. So we're going to insert a new bid into the database and then retrieve it and display the contents on the screen to make sure that everything is working correctly. Next slide.
All right, so the address table will store individual addresses. So some of the features that we're going to find on this table is that we're going to have 2 lines for addresses where they can be fulfilled with characters. So the user will be able to insert a personal address or event address. And then we're going to have the first some storage for city, state ID, and zip code. So we have some specific difference between the data type for some of them. For example, for city we use characters, but for state ID, as specified by the sponsor, we're gonna have a number that will correspond to a specific state, and so forth. Next slide. So for the verification, we are looking over the risks that we might have on these tables, but the risks will be talked better later. So I'm gonna focus more on the verification now, which we're gonna be doing the same, basically the same that we've been doing for the other tables, where we're gonna have a testing through a demonstration. For example, in this case, we can test the address ID, where we will create an account and add the address ID, and the address ID will be retrieved from the event database and display on the screen. So with that, we'll be able to see if the database is being stored, if it's accurate, and if it is in the right place. And the same pattern will be followed for the other features. Next slide. So next table is the hours table. That one will store the events hours. So there are 3 features for this table. The first one is the open, where the user will be able to select if the event is open, it's closed, basically like showing the status of the event. And then the day, which will store the date of the event, and the time specifying the time of the event. Next slide. And this will follow the same pattern for the other ones, where we have basically the same risk that we have identified so far. And we're gonna go through the same demonstration, like inserting the input and then retrieving the input from the database to make sure that it's all correct and follow all the requirements that we expect. Next slide.
So there are a number of risks associated with the database that are kind of natural given risks. So that they're just as follows. One of the biggest risks is where the data is being stored and if it's being stored in the wrong location. Another risk is the data structures that we use. We need to make sure that the data structure that we use is something that can be dynamically allocated for the number of users that we're going to have. And the final one is the databases are going to be containing personal information, and there is a concern about those being stolen or hacked. So there's certain ways to prevent and mitigate these risks. It needs to be ensured that during the software development, the location where the data is being stored in the right location, and that's going to be resolved through the verification methods, which we discussed before. The appropriate data structure also needs to be selected for the project, which will be selected in the SDD most likely. And the database itself needs to be encrypted and kept in a secure location, wherever that may be. And that concludes our presentation.